first of all, Orthodox Judaism believes that studying the Torah itself is an end in itself. It's not just in the academic world. When you study something, you're generally focused on sort of getting a piece of paper, a diploma, that says you have a BA or MA or a PhD or whatever, and you mastered this, and now you can get a job, and now you can work and whatever. But you don't necessarily care about the content of what you're learning, and certainly you don't care about the act of learning itself. But in Orthodox Judaism, the act of studying Torah, which sometimes when we say Torah, it's sort of a catch-all phrase for the Bible and rabbinics and halacha and Musar, which is a moral instruction, and Kabbalah and philosophy and all of these things together. Just the act of sitting there and studying and learning and seeing new things and going over the text and reading it again, just that act is viewed as an act of religious devotion, and is one of the is one or even more of the 613 commandments. So it's sort of a very different attitude than the types of attitudes that people have to education in the Western world.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Rabbi Reuven Chaim Klein, and we will be discussing the Orthodox Jewish tradition. There's not really much more that I can do to set this up, so I will say thoughts, feedback, guest suggestions, please send those to me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. If you're looking to provide moral support, that's a good way. If you're looking to provide material support for $5 a month, you can hear episodes at least a week early over on Patreon. So that link should be in the show notes, or you could go to Patreon and just search It Means What It Means. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Rabbi Klein. Rabbi Reuven Chaim Klein, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jared.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. I'm American. I grew up in Valley Village, California, which is sort of a somewhat suburban part of Los Angeles. I went to Jewish parochial schools, from nursery through elementary school. My elementary school is a little bit more what we considered modern Orthodox. The high school that I went to and post-high school Talmudic seminary was what we would consider more ultra-Orthodox. So I did 3 years high school, 2 years post-high school, all in Los Angeles. And then my rabbi in the high school, in post-high school, told me, I should go to a specific yeshiva in Israel to go study. So he sent me to go study in the Mir Yeshiva in Israel. You heard of that one? It's in Jerusalem. It's the largest yeshiva, about 8,000 students, from all over the world. I remember when I was there, I made a list of like 23 different countries that students have come from to study in the Mir Yeshiva. So I studied there for about 2 years, came back to America. I studied in a different yeshiva in Lakewood, New Jersey. Then I got married, moved back to Israel right after we got married. I went back to studying in the Mir that was in 2011 to 2020. After Corona, I started working from home, doing a freelance collaborator. See, every time I call myself a collaborator, it kind of sounds dirty because my mother was a Holocaust scholar. She worked for Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation. My mother was European, so she knew like a whole bunch of languages. So like she worked as a translator. So when I say collaborator, my first association is. But yeah, that's so basically I work collaborating all kinds of different projects as a writer, editor, translator. So that's what I do basically full time. And then I also write my own internationally syndicated column about synonyms in the Hebrew language. It appears in newspapers in America, England, Israel. And then I sometimes do, as a teacher, guest speaker. Also, I'm an author, so I try to sell books and, different things like that. So that's more or less what it is. Oh, and I'm still living, as I must have mentioned that I moved to Israel, and I'm living in Israel right now. So that's where I'm up to now.
That is a lot. And for our listener, sorry, you might hear my dog. I think there's a package at the door. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry about that. And for the listeners,
I mean, three out of 4 of my kids are still awake in bed. So
yeah, I'm sorry. Normally,
at least they're not barking.
Yeah, at least your kids aren't barking. Yeah, and click-clacking around on the floor like my dogs are. So For the listeners, this is a departure. It's the second departure, but this is a departure from the normal format. Normally, we're discussing a book or an article or an essay or something like that, but we are just kind of broadly discussing a tradition and how that tradition engages with biblical texts, but just kind of trying to come to understand the tradition overall. And in this conversation, that tradition is Orthodox Judaism. So we discussed it beforehand. I'll kick off with the first question. So, first question I sent you is there an age or time frame that Orthodox Jews begin studying biblical texts independently?
Okay, so I mean, first of all, we have to realize that Orthodox Jewry is not a monolithic entity. There's sort of different wings of Orthodox Jewry. There's that we call modern Orthodox, which is more liberal and less, let's say, focused on religion but more open to, let's say, the outside Western culture. And then at the other end of the spectrum is what they would call ultra Orthodox, which is more isolationist, more focused just on religion and trying to like sort of shun the outside world. And then there's centrist Orthodoxy, which is sort of somewhere in the middle. And these distinctions aren't so clear cut; they sort of bleed into each other. And in the same family, you can have people from multiple wings. Even the same person might vacillate in different ways between these different sort of parts of orthodoxy. So there's no it's very hard to say something definitive about what do Orthodox Jews do in general about like everything. So you're asking when did they what age and what time frame do they begin studying biblical texts independently? Let me ask you, what exactly do you mean by independently?
So I know that like in the document that you sent me that I kind of used as a jumping off point, so where I derived the thoughts that led to these questions, it talks about independent study of biblical I'll say biblical text, but of the Bible. I know where I grew up, the encouragement was always really, if the kid is even literate, that like it's biblical study is an individual's responsibility. It is not a communal, like liturgical engagement type thing. It's a bunch of different individuals reading. And so I guess I was wondering, does Orthodox Jewish worship center kind of does it focus on a liturgical reading and then also encourage independent reading? I mean, and this was a bad way of wording it. So
Okay, so let me ruminate about it. First of all, when Jews refer to the Bible, so just to clarify, the Jews refer to the 24 books of what you call the Old Testament, without the New Testament. I have a friend who consistently calls it the False Testament, but I think that's sort of needlessly
whoa.
It's needlessly provocative. But when we talk about the Bible, we focus specifically on the Old Testament and specifically the original Hebrew Masoretic text of the Bible, of those 24 books of the Bible. It's like when we refer to the Bible, that's sort of what we're talking about in the Jewish context. In the Jewish conception, there's what's called the written Torah. So that's like the Bible that you're familiar with, and then there's also the added aspect of the what's called the oral Torah, and the oral Torah is these rabbinic traditions that are found in the Talmud and the Midrashim and other rabbinic sources that explain and explicate and shed light on what the written Torah means. There's the rabbinic exegete par excellence is known as Rashi. He lived in the 1000s in France. He studied in Germany, but he lived in most of his life in France. And he's like the classic Jewish commentator on the Bible, and he offers sort of a unique blend of literal and also exegetical or homiletical explanations of the text itself. He draws heavily from rabbinic literature, but isn't quite citing them verbatim. He's very creative in the way he puts it into the text, and tries to show how textual oddities or allusions to different ideas that are found in the rabbinic sources. He was also clearly influenced by Jewish Spanish grammarians. So that's sort of Rashi. In terms of your question about studying the Bible as as a devotive act, so in the Jewish education system, there is this idea and this is already found in rabbinic sources. It says that when a child starts to be able to speak, so you're supposed to teach him the verse. There's a verse in Deuteronomy 34. Torah tzivah lanu Moshe Moshe Kilash Yaakov. Right? That Moses commanded us a Torah, which is an inheritance, which is a heritage for the for the the Jewish community. So we look at it as it's not just a religious and not just a religious or devotive act, but it's part of the education system. So I can't speak for everybody and how everybody experienced it, but my experience is fairly typical, and I can tell you that from first grade we're already studying the Bible, in class, in school, in the original Hebrew. Not long afterwards we're already studying Rashi alongside the actual text. First grade, second grade, we're already studying what we call the Pentateuch, which is the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And as soon as a kid knows how to read Hebrew and understand, they start going, and you just, different schools might cover ground more or less at different paces, at different rates. When I was a kid, we finished all of Genesis by fifth grade. We finished about half of Exodus just in fifth grade itself. In Leviticus, we did parts of Leviticus in seventh grade, or what they call the Holiness Code. So like we focused on that in seventh grade. In Numbers 19 through 24, we learned in eighth grade. So we cover a lot of ground just studying Bible in the class itself. My own son, he finished the entire Pentateuch in fourth grade. But what happens in the Jewish education system is that at a certain point, the focus switches from the written Torah to the oral Torah. So then, around fourth grade, fifth grade, they begin to study more of the oral Torah elements. So you study what's called the Mishnah and the Talmud, and as you start studying the Mishnah and the Talmud, that becomes more of the focus, and you're focusing less on studying the Bible itself. So that's why we covered less ground from like fifth grade and up than we did in the first few grades. So let's say in fifth grade, currently you're going to be studying a little bit of the Pentateuch, and then you're also studying a little bit of Mishnah and a little bit of Talmud, and then also they sort of introduced another discipline or another class, which was like on the prophets. So we're also concurrently studying the prophets. From fifth grade on, we're studying like the historical prophets, so like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and that was sort of a lot of the kids didn't. I remember a lot of the kids didn't take that too seriously. That class, the class in the prophets, it was more like story time. People would put like their heads down and they would sort of like relax, and not. It wasn't too intense, but that was definitely part of the curriculum. I myself, before we started learning the prophets in fifth grade, so I had actually studied the books of the prophets with my father on Saturday nights. So in our community, it's very common, and in a lot of communities they have this. It's called father and son learning, where father and son would sit together in a synagogue or in a community center, and they would just study different texts. So I had already been familiar with the prophets before we even started learning it in school. In terms of independent, it was actually, I think, in eighth grade that I decided at some point, very randomly, that I decided, I wanted to study the Book of Chronicles all on my own. And that sort of began my lifelong fascination with like genealogy and things like that. And I still into that type of stuff. But that was in eighth grade. So I purchased the Art Scroll. Art Scroll is like a Jewish Orthodox publisher that has very traditional, conservative type of books and commentaries on the entire Bible and on a lot of rabbinic works. So the Art Scroll, it translates it into English, and it elucidates and gives a digest of the different commentators. So I bought myself an Art Scroll volume on Chronicles, and that's when I sort of sat down and started learning the Bible on my own. Now, in Orthodox Judaism, there's a concept of Shnayim Mikra ve'echa Targum. It's twice the scripture and once the Targum. This is an idea, and we could talk about this a little bit later. This is an idea that a person sort of has to be in step with the rest of the Jewish community, the worldwide Jewish community, which is reading different parts of the Pentateuch every week. And there's an expectation that every male Jew is supposed to read that week's portion twice in the original Hebrew and once in the Aramaic Targum. So in my high school, we took this very seriously, and every Sunday morning we actually used to have a test on the Torah portion that we had read the previous day in the synagogue, which we had been studying the whole the week before. In our high school, we actually had official study sessions on Saturday afternoon or Saturday night, and in some grades we also had some study sessions in official school time. So that was sort of that was the high school experience in studying Bible. Post high school, studying the Pentateuch or the rest of the Bible is not really officially part of the curriculum in most circumstances. I think that more in Israel, in the religious Zionist community, maybe they are more into it, but in the mainstream, what they would call the yeshiva community in the ultra Orthodox world, it's not really officially part of the curriculum. It's not shunned, but it's not officially part of the curriculum, which really focuses more on the Talmud and the commentaries of the Talmud and stuff like that. So for most people, when official schooling ends, high school ends, or that's sort of when you're sort of that's your introduction to the Bible, and people don't really usually advance beyond an elementary or high school level understanding of the Bible. And then when you have kids and you go over the homework with your kids, so you do it again, and that's sort of like the general impression that I think most people would experience. It is true that on the large part, girls in the Jewish community, Orthodox Jewish community, actually do spend more time studying the Bible than the boys do, because the girls don't usually typically study the Mishnah or the Talmud. So the girls in their schooling, they spend more time on the Bible. But that like I said before, not you can't really say absolute statements about the entire Orthodox community as a whole. So like in more modern Orthodox settings, the girls might actually also spend time on the Talmud. So there's sort of different ways that it might play out. Just to talk about a little bit more about my personal experience, which this might not be how a lot of other people might experience it, but in my high school, so we had a specific right after prayers in the morning, we had a 15-minute study session, mandatory study session, where younger high school boys would study with older high school boys, but you could study whatever you want in those 15 minutes. So when I was in 9th and 10th grade, and perhaps maybe 11th grade, I don't remember, we chose to study specifically, the prophets, and in that framework, we went through, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, just the historical parts of the prophets. I personally took on myself about 20 years ago already to study this Shnai Mikra, this weekly Torah portion, with a different commentator each year. So each year, I'm not just going through the text of the Bible itself with the Targum, but I'm also going through various Jewish commentators, which is very enlightening. And if you study all kinds of different types of commentators, you can come out with a lot of interesting things. When I was studying in the Mir Yeshiva in Israel, at some point I decided, I want to learn the book of Joshua by myself, and I started looking at it, very in depth, looking at a lot of different sources, and actually filled up much of a notebook, going through that. After I got married in 2011, I don't even remember how I got into this, but somehow I found some sources that, some medieval Jewish sources that were discussing this question about whether Ezra, from the book of Ezra, whether he was just a priest or he was actually a high priest. And because he's described as a Kohen Rosh, so is a Kohen Rosh the same thing as a Kohen Gadol? So I wrote an entire essay about this, and eventually I published it in the Jewish Bible Quarterly. And I guess it was sort of the pleasure of publishing an article in a scholarly venue that sort of encouraged me to keep doing that and research other topics, related to the Bible within Jewish tradition, and publish more and write more and do more, all kinds of other stuff like that. So then I wrote another essay, reconciling internal biblical contradictions about Athaliah's parentage. And I brought all kinds of different Jewish traditions about that, and I did some research about that, and that's actually my most cited paper. But that was something I wrote about in the Jewish Bible Quarterly. And in the last over a span of 10 years, I wrote about 13 articles in the Jewish Bible Quarterly, plus a few different book reviews, notably the I wrote a book review about this book, The Divine Doppelgangers, that I heard about through this podcast, and that's I just got the proofs of that review earlier today, so it's supposed to be published in the next edition of the next volume of the Jewish Bible Quarterly. So different things like that, and on my own independent time, on my own independent edification and research, I just started going into different topics. And I once started writing a paper about there's a story in Kings about Naaman, the general of the Syrian army, wishing to bow down before the Syrian god Rimmon, and he was asking Elisha's permission whether he's allowed to do such a thing. And that sort of fascinated me. I started writing about the Syrian god Rimmon, and then I discovered there's like a whole bunch of other foreign deities that are mentioned in the Bible, and ended up writing a whole book about it. I wrote a book called God versus Gods: Judaism in the Age of Idolatry. Maybe we should like stop over here and give the audience a chance to go on Amazon and buy copies of my book. No, I'm just joking. But so yeah, that's my book, and so that's sort of my experience in studying biblical text independently. So is there a specific age or time frame? I don't know if there's a specific age or time frame. It's sort of something that we just grow up with, and a lot of people just drop out of it at a certain point when they start focusing on other things, and I just continued with it.
Okay. I mean, for me, it's a tradition I know very little about. So, kind of refining my questions to get a better idea of even how to approach it. But that was helpful. And actually, so on the topic of, I think there's some clarity that what Christians would call the Old Testament, but on this podcast I refer to as Hebrew Bible. So Hebrew Bible is, that's a part of Christian scripture that they would be familiar with, and then there's overlap between Christianity and Judaism there. But the part that's not overlap, is that closed? Like, so the Talmudic tradition, is that closed? If so, when did that close?
What do you mean by closed?
Well, so I mean, are there people still contributing to that kind of commentary that's engaged with, where Torah twice, Talmud once, if I'm getting that right? Is that still being added to?
So I mean, there's let's say the rabbinic tradition, the corpus of rabbinic works, like let's say the Talmud and the Targum and the Midrashim, and those are basically closed books. The Talmud itself was closed at about 500 CE, but then there's always more interpretations and layers of interpretations, and finding contradictions and trying to resolve contradictions, and trying to take statements and try to find the reason behind the statements, and try to find the the epistemologies and the dynamics behind how different things work. And that's sort of like an infinite amount of information and layers that you could just add and add and add on top of it. So in a way it is closed, but in a way it's still open. In Judaism we have this concept. It's called Shivim Panim LaTorah. It means that there's 70 faces to the Torah. It means that there's always like different layers or planes of interpretation. You can always have new insights and interpretations. So we're certainly adding more. Even if just in terms of a new way of understanding something old, or just bringing back something old. Nowadays, even there's like you can have new manuscripts of earlier commentators that are being published. So is that new or is that old? It's new because it hadn't been published before. People didn't have access to it, and it wasn't necessarily part of the tradition. But it's sort of old because it's something that wasn't written now. It might have been written 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago even. So it's sort of closed, but it's sort of open. Um, there's definitely a body of Orthodox biblical works on the Bible that keep coming out. More works. There's somebody named Yehuda Landy who writes a lot about. He was just passed away during Corona, but he had written books about archaeology and the Bible, interpreting the Bible in light of archaeology in ways that it jibes with Orthodox tradition, in ways that it jives with rabbinic commentators. There's something called Das Mikra, which was published by Mossad Rav Kook in Jerusalem, from the religious Zionist community, which also does similar things. There's a lot of there are journals There's a journal, Tradition, which is published by the RCA, the Rabbinic Council of America, which I happen to be a member of. There's another journal called Hakira. They're publishing articles. Not all articles have to do with the Bible, but they're definitely publishing articles with new insights in the Bible, new interpretations in light of, let's say, archaeology and comparative linguistics, and other new findings from the ancient Near East and stuff like that. There's definitely publishers publishing books within the Orthodox Jewish community. Art Scroll, which is very traditional, I mentioned before. Mosaic Press, which published my books, which are a little bit more open-minded. Kodesh Press, which might be even more open-minded. They're publishing tons and tons of books all the time. Not all of them are necessarily on the Bible, but there's definitely some of them are discuss the Bible and are certainly valid and new contributions. There's the Jewish Bible Quarterly, which is not completely Orthodox, but there are definitely articles in each issue which do work with Orthodox sensibilities and do come from an Orthodox perspective.
And so that's actually a pretty helpful segue, because one of the things I was thinking while you were talking is Judaism is not simply about, well, here we have the Bible and now that's all we are. So what else would you use to explain, here is what Jewish life is, to someone who's not Jewish and doesn't know what Jewish life is?
Okay, so I mean, Jewish. We can start from, let's say, the basics. One of the basic concepts that they throw around in Judaism is there's 613 commandments. The number 613 is not found explicitly in the Bible. It's actually comes from the Talmud in the Tractate Makos 23a. And there's actually different ways of counting exactly what the 613 commandments are and what's considered a commandment and what's not considered a commandment. And those commandments come, broadly speaking, from the Bible with rabbinic interpretation. So there's those core biblical commandments, and then there's rabbinic enactments, that are there to support the biblical commandments. So that's sort of the bedrock of Jewish law, called halacha. So that's one aspect of Jewish life. There's the aspect of prayer. There's the aspect of there's different theology, philosophy, Kabbalah. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking about. Maybe you can clarify a little bit more.
Well, so I want to try not to do this a ton, but I have to base my understanding of the world off of my experience. And in my experience growing up evangelical Christian in America, that centers around belief. But my understanding is that's not necessarily at the center of Judaism. Judaism is an identity that is much more full than simply, I believe X and so I am Jewish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they say that Judaism is a religion of action. So there is a belief aspect of it, and what exactly the dogmas of Judaism are. There's there's different ways of formulating them. Maimonides has his 13 principles of faith, and there's more Kabbalistic or more esoteric inclined streams of Judaism might state things slightly differently than Maimonides' philosophical bend, but Judaism is really more focused on the action than on the beliefs. The beliefs are also part of it, but it is definitely more focused on the action. I forgot what my point was. What was the question again?
Well, I don't know that there was a question. it was more just like, here was my experience. But kind of, I don't know, taking that kind of makes sense, because I mean, the way I've heard people explain, like, if you want to behave differently, behave differently. Don't wait until you think differently. The best way to influence the way you think is to act the way you want to act. And so rather than saying, oh, well, we believe this and that's what defines who we are, you're saying we are active, whether that's through the act of circumcision or the act of halakha or any of the myriad things.
It's sort of like this. You could say it like this. The belief obligates you in certain responsibilities. If you believe in God and you believe that God has a purpose for the world and who wants certain people to do certain things, so then those beliefs demand that you take certain courses of action. And one aspect of those courses of action is these 613 commandments. One of your goals in life is you want to fulfill God's will. God wants you to do this, so you do it. That's one of the core ideas in Orthodox Judaism.
And so that is part of, I don't know if process is the right word, but that's part of the process of being Jewish.
Right. That's part of the I don't know, process. So it's the lifestyle. It's the experience. We also believe that God has expectations of all of humanity. He has, in the Talmud that talks about the 7 Noahide laws. So the 7 commandments that God wants, this is what he expects of the Noahides, of the non-Jews. And this this 613 commandments that he expects of the Jews. It's like a sort of different expectations of different types of people. So that's sort of this idea of focus on actions.
Okay, and so actually, so you mentioned there's the Pentateuch, and you mentioned prophets. What are the sections of the Jewish Bible? Because my understanding is it's set up differently than what most Christians are used to when they flip to what they call the Old Testament.
Okay, yeah. So the Jewish Bible is, in Hebrew we call it Tanakh, which is a acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. So Torah is the Pentateuch. That's like the first section. Torah is the 5 books of Moses, and then the Nevi'im, the N part of the Tanakh, is the prophets, which includes from Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 prophets. People call it the 12 minor prophets, but I don't like calling them minor prophets. Like, who are you to say who's a major prophet and who's a minor prophet? The Talmud says that the reason why there's one book of 12 prophets is because they just happen to have not written as much prophecy, so we want to not lose them, so we put them together so that they don't get lost. But that doesn't make them less important to be minor prophets. And then there's the Ksuvim, which is called the writings, also known as, I believe, the hagiography, something like that. I don't remember what they call it in English. The hagiographa, which consists of Psalms and this, what we call in Hebrew the 5 scrolls, and Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, or Nehemiah in Hebrew, Chronicles, Mishlei, which is Proverbs, and the 5 scrolls, which is a category which is not so commonly known in sort of the academic world. The 5 scrolls are Esther, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Ruth, and Ruth. So those are the 5 scrolls. Oh, and Job is also in the writings.
Okay, and so
I think I mentioned everything. I'm doing it by heart with my wife making comments in the peanut gallery.
You're doing great. Yeah, don't worry. No, to knock those 3 headings, and I think for the Christian Bible it's different. So I just wanted to put that idea out there that it is organized differently, and so probably
the
understood.
order is also different. I probably should have focused on the order because the order is also different. But when I said it, I wasn't saying it order. I was just saying what popped in my head first.
No, yeah, and again, you're fine. You're recalling from memory. No one, I certainly am not going to judge you. So, but okay. So on Saturday, on Shabbat, how are biblical texts involved in Orthodox Jewish worship?
Okay, great question. So first of all, there's, let's say, the prayer aspect, and then there's the reading from the Torah aspect. So we can talk about prayer. A lot of prayer, what we call the formulaic liturgy, is actually just verses or chapters taken from the Bible. Especially Psalms. A lot of pieces from the prayers are just come from Psalms. Let's say the song of the day. There's a Mishnah that talks about how in the temple each day they used to sing a separate song from Psalms that accompanies the daily sacrifices. So each day was a different day. So we are accustomed to saying those songs each day, a separate song. There's something called the Psuki de Zimra, the chapters of hymns that we say in the morning. So that focuses on like the last few chapters of Psalms. We just say that as part of the morning prayers. One of the big focuses of Jewish prayer is the Shema, which consists of basically two selections from Deuteronomy. So those are just simply just reading or saying over parts of the Bible as part of the prayer. So there's the prayer aspect, and we could talk more a little bit about prayer a little bit later on if you want. And then there's the reading from the Torah aspect. And what happens is that every Saturday or Shabbat or Shabbos, if you use the Ashkenazi pronunciation, we take out a Torah scroll and we read one of the portions of the Torah. It's called the Parsha, the weekly Parsha. So the way it works is that there's sort of a cycle where you start reading a part of the Torah, and then you end up going through the entire Sefer Torah. You finish the entire Torah scroll in the course of a certain amount of time. In Talmudic times, there were two customs. There was the Babylonian custom of finishing the Torah annually, once a year, which is what we do nowadays. And then there's what they call the Palestinian or Israeli custom of the triennial cycle, where they would finish the Torah once every 3 years. That nobody in the Orthodox world does that nowadays. Nowadays, we all do the annual custom, even though as recently as like 900 years ago, both customs existed side by side. In Cairo, there were synagogues which went both ways. So the weekly Torah portion you can sort of see on a Jewish calendar, where it starts, where it ends, each week. The yearly cycle starts with the beginning of Genesis, the week after Sukkot. Sukkot is the holiday in the beginning of the fall. It's called, I guess, in the Festival of Tabernacles, or the Festival of Booths in English they call it. And so you go every week, you read a different portion on Saturday, until you finish the end of Deuteronomy on the 8th day of Sukkot, the 8th day of Sukkot, which is known as Simchas Torah, the happiness of the Torah, because that's the day that you sort of finish reading that cycle of the Torah. The unfortunate events of October 7th last year happened on the day of Simchas Torah, which was supposed to be a very happy day and ended up being a very much the opposite of that. So the Torah is read. That's the cycle of the Torah readings on Sabbath morning. The Torah is actually usually read 4 times a week. It's read Monday morning, Thursday morning, Saturday morning, and then Saturday afternoon. The Jewish prayer, we communally pray 3 times a day. There's morning, afternoon, and evening. So on the Sabbath in the afternoon, we also read from the Torah scroll. So what we read on Monday and Thursday is going to be the beginning section of what you're going to end up reading on the following Saturday. And then Saturday afternoon, you're also reading where you're going to read the beginning of the section that you're going to read the next Saturday morning. So sort of that's how it works. And then there's special readings for holidays and fast days. And all of this is read from the sort of the Torah scroll. So that's sort of how that's how the Torah scroll and the reading of the Torah fits into the Saturday services.
Is it still actually a scroll? I know that might be a silly question.
Yeah, no. It is actually a scroll, with written on parchment that's taken from the hide of a kosher animal that was slaughtered, in a kosher way, and treated in different ways that it could be used as parchment, and taken with written with ink, handwritten by a person. It happens to be that with a quill. There happens to be that in the city that I live in, there's like a really interesting proportion of the population are actually scribes, and even just in my building, there are like 4 or 5 different people who actually work as professional scribes. And one of the main things that they do is they write Torah scrolls, they write phylacteries, they write mezuzahs, they write other scrolls as well. So that's really still done like that.
I had no idea. That's really cool. This is the first I'm hearing. I didn't know that there were still scribes. I guess I've seen enough, like film of a bar or bat mitzvah of them reading their Torah portion and seeing them reading from a scroll. But I guess maybe I just thought that was like TV, Hollywood presenting something.
They still do that. There is a controversial thing called a silk screen Torah scroll, which is sort of like printing, but it's not quite printing, and it's like less handwritten. But it hasn't been accepted by most Orthodox authorities, so I don't think it's become like really mainstream. But it produces sort of the same idea. Yeah,
And so the prescribed readings that you're talking about, those are the same ones that you were talking about being tested on when you were in school?
yeah. The weekly Torah portion.
Okay. I was wondering that when you were talking about it. I'm glad we got to circle back around to that. How difficult is it to find the place in the scroll, or is that something that you go in and you pre-mark beforehand?
Um, and that's an interesting question. I not long ago, a lady reached out to me on LinkedIn, and she was asking me for some different advice about publishing a book about how to help people find like their Torah portion in a Torah scroll. And I look at it, I'm like, that's like so weird, because I guess to me, like, I'm just so familiar with it that I could sort of see just a part of the column, and I can more or less tell you, where in the scroll you are. You know, I guess for some people that are not as familiar with it, they would have trouble finding it. But if you usually there's like a person who's experienced, a Torah reader who's usually the one that actually reads from the Torah scroll. It's not just every person randomly reading from it, except for a bar mitzvah. The bar mitzvah boy usually reads a little bit of something from the Torah scroll. But also the scroll is already rolled to where you're supposed to be reading from, because when you're finished last week, so you just leave it there, and then the next time you pull it out, it's at the same place. So the only time you really need to roll around is if you need to go to special readings for holidays or fast days, or when you finish at the end, you roll it all the way back to the beginning. So I do think that some people do have that difficulty, but to me it's just kind of silly. But that's just an interesting question.
I mean, it is a different technology than a book, like a modern day book. So if all you know is modern day, but like all I know is modern day books, so engaging with that probably would be more awkward for me. But I mean, you've been doing it for years, so it's less awkward for you, right?
Yeah.
You think I could pick it up? I'm hearing that you have confidence in me.
Yeah, no, it's like reading a PDF where where you put it on that mode where it's like the whole thing is one page and you just scroll up and down.
I hate that mode. I've tried that with my Kindle, and I end up just like I like that it's pretending to be a page, and it looks like something is swiping and changing. So I guess I like being deceived. Is it customary to bring your own Bible to synagogue, or is everyone just focused on the reading that's happening at the front?
Okay, so there is the Torah scroll that belongs to the synagogue, and the one who reads from it, and usually everyone follows along in a book. Which the book colloquially is called a chumash, which basically means like Pentateuch, and it's sort of the same thing that's written in the Torah, but in the Torah it's not written with vowels; it's just written the consonants, and the Torah doesn't have the cantillation marks, or it doesn't mark the end of a chapter or the end of a verse. And in the Chumash, in the printed books, so all of these things are written. It's a slightly different font, and people follow along in the book. The book what's written in the book is sort of the same thing that's written in the scroll, just in a more user friendly way, let's say. So yeah, people do. The synagogue itself will have a whole bunch of these books. So anyone who comes, you can take a prayer book, and you'll take your Torah book to follow along with the person reading from the Torah scroll. Yeah, or you could bring one from your house. It's sort of the same thing.
So, okay, well, that's interesting. So, like, in your day to day life in Israel, there is Hebrew spoken, Hebrew written. How similar or different is that to the Hebrew in the Torah?
It's a good question. A lot has been written on that question. First of all, we have to understand that the Hebrew language has a lot of different layers to it. There's biblical Hebrew, and then there's rabbinic Hebrew, which is the language of like the Mishnah and the Talmud, which is a slightly it's a different. The words might be similar. The way that verbs are conjugated are slightly different, and the style is slightly different. So there definitely are differences and similarities. It's hard to know exactly. If a person only spoke modern Hebrew, would he not be able to understand the Bible in the original? Hard to know. It wouldn't go very smoothly, but I don't think he would have that much difficulty reading it or understanding it.
Okay. So, well, I mean, okay. So you grew up in America, so I'll just use this comparison. I can sit down and read Shakespeare, right? But I don't speak that particular kind of English. Is it that kind of a divide, or is it something more, or is it something closer?
No. I think it's, yeah. I think that the difference between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew is much less than the difference between Shakespearean English and modern English.
Oh, wow.
It's much closer.
Okay. That's okay. That is good to know. Okay, so I want you to have time for recommendations and things like that. But first, is there anything, I know that I sent you questions and I didn't cover them all, but I did tell you that up front that I probably wasn't going to. Is there anything that you were hoping that I was going to ask that I have not asked?
Oh, I was hoping that you would ask all 11 questions.
Well, which one's your favorite?
Let's do this one. One of the questions you were going to ask is, is there a level of education that yeshiva and kollel can be compared to for those who are unfamiliar? So I think that was an interesting question that sort of got me thinking a lot. And I would say that there's no one-to-one correspondence between the level of education in yeshiva and kollel to sort of things that you encounter in the Western world, because it really varies so much. First of all, Orthodox Judaism believes that studying the Torah itself is an end in itself. It's not just in the academic world, when you study something, you're generally focused on sort of getting a piece of paper, a diploma, that says you have a BA or MA or a PhD or whatever, and you mastered this, and now you can get a job, and now you can work and whatever. But you don't necessarily care about the content of what you're learning, and certainly you don't care about the act of learning itself. But in Orthodox Judaism, the act of studying Torah, which sometimes when we say Torah, it's sort of a catch-all phrase for the Bible and rabbinics and halacha and Musar, which is the moral instruction, and Kabbalah and philosophy and all of these things together. It's just the act of sitting there and studying and learning and seeing new things and going over the text and reading it again. Just that act is viewed as an act of religious devotion, and is one or even more of the 613 commandments. So it's sort of a very different attitude than the types of attitudes that people have to education in the Western world. In the yeshiva and kollel, in the Orthodox Judaism, we have a sort of totally different epistemology than they have in academia. Academia focuses a lot on form and methodology and discipline, and in the yeshiva world, it's more, we don't care so much about like how exactly you learn, or if you want to do it in this way or in that way, or you want to read it first and then translate it, or you want to think about it and then look at this comment. Like, it doesn't really matter. You just focus on getting the content, understanding the content, and sort of moving forward, or getting it deeper and things like that. In part of our epistemology, and modern Orthodoxy might be less into this, and ultra Orthodoxy might be more into this, but part of this epistemology is that we view earlier sources as more important than, let's say, cutting edge. So mastery over traditional sources is more important than coming up with like new ideas, new rulings, new theologies. That we're focused more on looking at the old text and trying to understand it, and what were they thinking and how did they understand it and things like that. And academia would just look at that as more like a antiquarianism instead of scholarship. So in that way, it's sort of hard to compare the type of education in yeshiva and kollel to what they have in sort of in universities. Even within a single institute, people can be at widely varying levels of expertise. On the same bench, you can have a person who's just beginning Talmud study and a person who's been studying Talmud for 20, 30 years, and they can be interacting with each other and having conversations with each other, which in the academic world, you don't really see so much. If you send an email to a professor that you don't have any relationship with, he will most likely ignore it. And if he writes you back, he will say to you, did you read my book on this topic? And did you read this? And did you read this? And did you read this? First read all of that and then come back to me. And if you have any questions, then we can talk. And there's less of that elitist attitude in the yeshiva and kollel environment. It's more like we're all here together, we're all studying together, and we can all interact with each other. And if I have a difficulty understanding something, I could just ask any random person, whether he's older than me, younger than me, it doesn't really matter, and we can discuss it and try to figure it out. There is this idea of rabbinic ordination. Again, there's no like monolithic definition of what is rabbinic ordination, but it usually entails like some sort of test over mastery of different parts of Jewish law. Different people giving the ordination might have different expectations, whether it's a private rabbi or an institute of learning or the Israeli rabbinate. They have different ways of what they expect you to know to receive your ordination. But there is this sort of an equivalent to a diploma or a piece of paper that says that you know something, which you get with an academic education. But most people that are studying in yeshiva or kollel, they're not trying to get rabbinic ordination. They're just trying to sit there and learn. If they feel that they want to get rabbinic ordination, or they're under pressure, they feel like they want to get a job within the rabbinate or within become some sort of professional rabbi. So then they try to get some sort of at least a nominal ordination, if not really in depth studying it. So there is that similarity. And another similarity that I was thinking about is this idea of specialization, which you see a lot in university education, where people they specialize in such a very specific niche topic that even within something that's like quite slightly adjacent to their topic, they can't even hold a conversation, because that's not what they studied, and that's not what they know about. So like they don't want to talk to you. So you do see that in certain ways in yeshiva and kollel education, where you have this specialization. You have people writing books and studying courses on very arcane aspects of the Talmud or of Jewish law, and it's like very, very specific things on certain tractates, or just certain topics within certain tractates. And you're seeing, I think, less and less generalists. Just like in university, you don't see people like studying, let's say, the humanities as a whole or liberal arts as a whole. People going into more very, very specific topics. So there is that trend. There is also opposing trends. There's something called daf yomi, which is not necessarily in the educational institutions, but it's more of like a popular communal thing, a movement, where people are sort of studying one. Yeah, it's usually studied by people who are outside of the educational yeshiva or kollel framework. And daf yomi literally means a page a day, and they're trying to study the entire Talmud by learning a page a day, which ends up you end up finishing the whole thing in 7.5 years. So they are aiming for a generalist perspective, a generalist way of understanding things. But I think that the trend is really more this specialization. I'm going to focus on just these few pages of the tractate or this topic, and I think that's sort of comparable to what you see nowadays in the universities.
How about rabbis that tend to deal more with, I guess, a congregation? I'm not sure if that's the right word, but who tend to deal with a congregation for things like, counseling or just a sympathetic ear, and as in addition to biblical studies and teaching.
Right. Okay. So I mean, like I was saying about rabbinic ordination, there's a difference between having a piece of paper that says this person learned certain parts of Jewish law, and you can call him rabbi, and then there's something called rabbi as a job, as a profession. And rabbi as a job or as a profession can mean a lot of different things. And let's say it can be a rabbi of a synagogue or a community, which every synagogue and community has different expectations of what exactly they want from their rabbi. Rabbi can mean a chaplain, whether it's an army chaplain, a police chaplain, a jail chaplain. Rabbi can mean a person who's a kashrut inspector. He inspects food, or inspects devices to make sure that it's compatible with Shabbos observance, with Shabbat observance. A rabbi can mean a dayan, which is a rabbinic judge. A rabbi can mean the head of a yeshiva, the head of a kollel. A rabbi could be a teacher, elementary teacher, high school teacher. He can be a scribe, like I mentioned before. He can be a mohel, which is a ritual circumciser. There's a lot of different things a rabbi could be. He could be a slaughterer. He could be involved in outreach. He could be involved in kids at risk. He could be involved in counter missionary work. He can be involved in political advocacy. All these different community, all of these different things. They require certain skills and certain knowledge. And if you want to get that type of job, so you have to have at least some sort of background or show the ability of to engage in that type of in that type of occupation. There's also the Hasidic rabbi or a Kabbalistic master, spiritual gurus. Those are all also called rabbis, but the body of knowledge that or the skills that are required of them, are different from just a person who has ordination. He studied parts of rabbinic law. So the word rabbi just literally means my master. Rav Shali. Rabbi means my master. If people accept you as a master, as a teacher, a leader, then you become a rabbi. The way I look at it is like I write books and I write articles, and people read my books and articles, and they responded and they replied to me and they asked me questions, and so because of that, I sort of became a teacher. So to those people, to those readers of mine, and so I look at myself as like I'm their rabbi in some sense. But as I said before, like traditional rabbinic ordination usually means like a test, one or two tests, or different areas of Jewish law, whether they're oral or they're written tests. I think it used to be more oral tests, and nowadays there's combinations of written oral tests. I personally have multiple rabbinic ordinations, taken different tests by different rabbis and different things like that. As again, like what exactly a community, a rabbi serving in a synagogue or a pulpit, what they expect from him, it differs from community to community. Sometimes the rabbi is just a glorified fundraiser. Sometimes he's expected to give Talmud lessons. Sometimes he's expected to give these ornate weekly sermons. In more ultra-Orthodox circles, the rabbi is very busy answering detailed halachic questions, doing research and trying to figure things out. He's less of a preacher. The rabbis might be involved in adjudicating monetary disputes. He might be involved in teaching people who want to convert to Judaism. There's all kinds of different hats and roles that a rabbi might wear, and you might wear a bunch of different hats at the same time. Depending on the institute and the specific rabbinic candidate, what exactly that training might be, it might differ from case to case. There's what you mentioned before, though, the element of the pastoral care, of counseling, helping congregants and students deal with, let's say, life cycle events and issues, birth, marriage, end of life issues, death, burial, mourning. All of these things are important for a rabbi to know and to be able to deal with, especially if he's involved in a community, both from a halachic perspective, from a Jewish law perspective, and also from a pastoral perspective. The rabbi sort of in certain ways also functions as like a psychologist. He's there to hear what people's problems are and help them to deal with it. He's a fundraiser. He has to help the poor as well. Try to if congregants need financial help, so he'll try to rally the troops and try to get it. So that's also part of what the training could be in certain circumstances. Part of what a rabbi might study is rhetoric, pedagogy, how to conduct public relations, different things like that. I personally took different courses in some of these fields at a place called the Or Lagola Institute in Jerusalem, which is set up for training people people in yeshiva and kollel to become pulpit rabbis, teachers, rabbinic outreach professionals, all over the world. And they train them up and send them out, and they have people on college campuses. They have people who've taken over synagogues. They've taken over communities that are sort of gentrified and failing and dying out, and sort of bringing in a young rabbi to invigorate it. So that's sort of what exactly is the process for becoming a rabbi, and what it means to be a rabbi, what the different types of trainings a rabbi has.
I think much like several other things in this conversation, my experience has kind of limited me and siloed me in my understanding, because like a preacher's a preacher. That's what he is. So it's kind of like a welder's a welder. But what you're saying is talking about a welder as opposed to a handyman. A handyman does all of these things, could do so many things, may be capable of doing, 9 of the 15 tasks I'm asking for, or that one may be capable of doing all 15.
Yeah,
So
I'm not saying that any one person has to do all of them. There's different combinations, and every situation is different. A preacher who can also answer questions of law, people will take him more seriously. If he's just he can say a lot of jokes and he can entertain a crowd, it's a different level of preacher. So like there's different there's different ways of looking at it.
Cool. So where would you send people to read, watch, listen, etc., to learn more about Orthodox Judaism?
Oh, that's interesting. There's a website called simpletoremember.com, which has all kinds of lectures about Judaism, from basic introductions to more intermediate things. There's a website called Torah Anytime where you can access different lectures on Judaism. Wikipedia is a source, but you have to be careful because different editors in Wikipedia have different agendas, and to get a picture of orthodoxy from orthodoxy's own perspective, Wikipedia might not be the best, but it will give you an overall a broader perspective on different topics. There's a website www.aish.com. That's aish.com. That's not scholarly. That's more like a popular look at Judaism. There's a website or.edu. That's ohr.edu. That'll give you a lot of interesting articles, and that's dedicated to outreach, taking people who are might be Jewish but don't know anything about Judaism and trying to teach them the basics. There's also Chabad, Chabad. They teach a lot about Judaism. So there are a lot of different resources online that a person can get. There's a lot of books also. Books are outdated. I don't know if anyone reads books anymore. I mean, I hope they do, because part of my livelihood comes from book sales. But that's just one part of my bookshelf, and this is just another part of my bookshelf. And if I turn my computer a different way, you'll see another 4 walls like that, and three walls like that. But yeah, not 3 walls, 3 shanks. They call it shanks.
So, listeners, since he gave you a bunch of free sources to learn more about Orthodox Judaism, you should go buy his book.
Yeah, so I have 2 books out there. One is called Lashon HaKodesh, History, Holiness in Hebrew, and it goes through the history of the Hebrew language. It is actually sold out right now, so you can't get it, but it should be available in a few months. We're reprinting it. And then my other book is God versus Gods, Judaism in the Age of Idolatry, which talks about the history of idolatry, in the Bible, going through the stories of the struggle against idolatry as depicted in the Bible, and it has an encyclopedia of different types of foreign deities that are mentioned in the Bible. So that book is still available as of now, so you can get it on Amazon and wherever good books are bought.
What do you read for fun?
What do I read for fun? So during Corona, I decided that I want to get a lot. I need a lot of books to read because I'm bored. So I started a website. It's called the Rachak Review, RACHACK Review, where you send me a book and I'll write a review of your book. So I get all kinds of random books. Some of them interest me and some of them don't interest me, but I like to fancy myself an intellectual. So if it's even a somewhat interesting topic, I'll say, yeah, send me your book and I'll take a look at it and I'll read it and I'll write a review. And I did it partially as a selfish way of getting books to read for free, and partially because in my own experience as an author, I found that in the Orthodox Jewish world, it's very hard to find venues that actually publish book reviews, because one of the ideas that floats around in Judaism is that we don't want to engage in slander, lashon hara. We don't want to say badmouth anybody. So in order to have like a real objective critical book review, you might have to say things that are not so nice about a specific book or an author. And the Jewish publications, the popular press, try to shy away from these things. So because of that, a lot of the Orthodox Jewish books, they don't get as much exposure. So I figured, I'm going to fill in that blank, and I'm going to try to give people that exposure. You can send me your book, and I'll write up different. So here on my shelf, I have right now. I'm in the middle of reading 3 different books. One is a book by Isaac Gottlieb called Order as Meaning: Chronology, Sequence, and Juxtaposition in the Bible. So that's one book. Another book I'm reading is called Critiques of Theology: by Yotam Hotam, German Jewish Intellectuals and the Religious Sources of Secular Thought. This is hard to understand, but it's an interesting one. And then there's this book called Divrei Sofrim, The Transmission of Torah Shebal Peh, Rabbi Herschel Schechter, published by Maggid Press. So whenever I have some free time, which isn't so often, I sit down and try to read at least one of those 3 books. So that's what I do in my free time.
Cool. Okay. Rabbi Klein, thank you for sitting down with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for what? What are you saying?
You said you have 4 kids and you take them to the park.
Oh, and my wife wants me to add that I have 4 kids and I take them to the park when they need to get taken to the park, and I study with them and I do their homework and I teach them the alphabet and I read with them and study with them and stuff like that. So,
and in between that is when you get to read those books.
In between that is when I get to read the books and work and and do everything else that I do in life.
Fantastic. Love to see a good dad. Okay, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. Take care.
You too.
Thank you so much for listening. There is no tag for next week's episode. There is no preview for next week's episode, because next on the podcast is going to be a clip episode of the conversations that I have recorded so far for 2025. I'll present them in reverse order so that episode will end with a preview of the following episode, which will be my conversation with Michael Kashanash on use of Josephus in the Gospel of Luke. So that's an interesting conversation. But again, yeah, I decided not to put a clip here because as this episode will be coming out, I'm scheduling it for December 30th. The very next day, the clip episode, the 2025 preview episode, will be coming out with a whole bunch of clips. So I decided not to do that. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate the download. That is very practical support. Getting more downloads means getting more attention. Every day, getting more downloads means moving closer and closer to being a podcast that has a larger audience, because as you listen, I just draw the inference that you are telling friends about it if you like it, that you are continuing to subscribe, and so the audience is growing with every new listener. And with every listener who's stuck around since the beginning, I appreciate that too. You guys, so you may not know it, but I can see in where the downloads are that, there are places that people have been downloading for a longer time than others. And that means the world to me. If, however, you are looking to provide additional support, that would be greatly appreciated. Whether that's feedback by reaching out to me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com or becoming a Patreon supporter for $5 a month. And at least for now, getting access at least a week in advance of free releases. Any support for the podcast puts me over the moon and makes me immensely happy. So I'll be back tomorrow on the free release side of things with a clip episode of previews for 2025. Take care. Thank you.